Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.
A breath, a heartbeat, and Messi! Thuram, Mbappe!
Oh, lovely.
Argentina, champions of the world!
Qatar recruited hundreds of thousands of workers, mainly from India, Nepal and Bangladesh. And once they got to Qatar, they were already in debt and trapped in a system known in the Middle East as kafala.
The kafala system can be a form of modern-day slavery, and the features of it amount in some cases to forced labor.
The host of the FIFA World Cup 2034 will be Saudi Arabia.
Welcome back, listeners. In our last episode, we examined the rumors about Saudi abolishing kafala, its employer-tied visa sponsorship system, which turned out to be fake news. Today, we're going to talk about Saudi and sport as it gears up to host the 2034 FIFA World Cup. Join me as I chat to Nicholas McGeehan, founding co-director of the organization FairSquare. Stay tuned. Hello, Nick. Good morning, and thanks so much for being with us today. To all of our listeners, I have with us Nicholas McGeehan, who is the program director at an organization named FairSquare. So, hello, Nick, and very, very excited about the conversation we're going to have.
Hi, Namrata. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be welcomed on.
We're thrilled to have you here. So perhaps we could start off, Nick, with what are the issues you found in Qatar, and then perhaps we can extend what parallels you see or don't see in Saudi as well.
So Qatar wasn't really on the international map in any real sense until it won the right to host the FIFA World Cup in 2010.
The winner to organize the 2022 FIFA World Cup is Qatar.
So they had about 12 years to prepare for it. They didn't really have any stadiums. They didn't have the infrastructure that was required to host an event of that size. And so they embarked on this huge construction spree to overhaul the country's infrastructure, to put in place the stadiums that were necessary and the hotels, of course, to accommodate all the guests and supporters that would visit. Because, tremendous reliance on foreign workers, mostly South Asian workers, they had to import hundreds of thousands, millions of workers, extra workers, to make this all possible. And unfortunately, the labour system in Qatar, as in the rest of the Gulf states, is deeply abusive and exploitative. So this was, to some extent, I think, an opportunity for rights groups and trade union groups to sort of shine a spotlight on what was happening and to try and push for change, meaningful reform that would better protect these workers. There are some people who came out of that experience and pointed to some legal reforms that existed on paper and look at it as a success in terms of what we achieved. And certainly I think that narrative has crept into a lot of the reporting of the Qatar World Cup. I think the reality is it was a human rights catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of mostly young men were brought in to make that tournament possible. And these people were treated abysmally. Far too many of them suffered serious injury, loss of livelihoods, unpaid wages. And far too many of them just didn't make it home at all and left families with no answers as to how they died and financially impoverished and destitute.
Thanks, Nick. And I think that so many organizations like yours and human rights folks like yourself, as well as trade unions, as you mentioned, helped shine a spotlight on this happening in the first place, because I think perhaps many people didn't know how bad it was prior. That's the sense I had. So a couple of things. So you mentioned Qatar. Can you tell us where things stand right now with Saudi? Have they been awarded the World Cup? And what's the situation in terms of the Saudi labor system? Are you concerned that there will be some parallels between Qatar and Saudi? What's your take overall?
Sure. So Saudi Arabia has wanted the World Cup for a long time. They started, maneuvering, shall we say, with FIFA a long time ago and tried to get their name attached to a future World Cup. They were eventually awarded the tournament formally, I think in December last year. The process whereby FIFA awarded the right to host the 2034 Men's World Cup to Saudi Arabia was really quite remarkable in the sense that FIFA bent its rules, changed its rules, and in some cases actually broke its own rules in order to make sure, firstly, that Saudi Arabia was the only bidder for the tournament, and then to ensure that it was awarded the tournament without a vote by the FIFA Congress. So that speaks, I think, to the level of influence that Saudi Arabia has been able to exert over FIFA. Now, the way that they do that is they are essentially FIFA's most lucrative sponsors. Saudi Aramco will now be the main sponsor of FIFA as an organisation. And they've also been able to sort of indirectly channel massive amounts of broadcasting revenue into FIFA in the last year. So they are one of its biggest benefactors. And this is all hugely relevant, of course, because the amount of infrastructure that's going to be required for Saudi Arabia is, again, I mean, it was jaw-dropping in Qatar and it's the same in Saudi Arabia. They're going to have to build, I think it's 11 new stadiums and refurbish 4. They're going to have to build 73 new training sites. They're going to have to build broadcasting centres. There's going to be an increase in 500% of the hotel capacity. And there's an increase in capacity of the airports from, I think it's 95 million, 240 million annual passengers. The labour system in Saudi Arabia is basically the same as the labour system in Qatar, the same as the labour system in the UAE, same as Oman, same as Kuwait. Essentially these Gulf states all have the same system, which ensures that employers have vast amounts of power over the non-national employees that they bring in. It is underpinned by serious racial discrimination, and it yields appalling results from, as the ones I described earlier in Qatar, the most serious of which are obviously loss of life, but the general day-to-day treatment of migrant workers is appalling. The word slavery is often thrown around in relation to migrant workers. I personally have no problems with that issue being used as long as it's used precisely and correctly. And I think in many cases, I think what we are talking about is a system that facilitates and enables enslavement. Now, these are obviously in the worst types of cases, right? It would be ridiculous to say that all migrant workers in Saudi Arabia are slaves. They're not. But does the labour system, is it so abusive and exploitative that it enables their enslavement? Yes, I think it does. And so we have 9 years out from the Saudi Arabia 2034 World Cup with all this infrastructure to be done and with little to no sign that they're going to put in place the significant labour reforms that you would need to actually completely alter the power dynamic that exists between the workers who come from places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh and India are the two main providers of low-paid migrant labour to Saudi Arabia. And there's nothing really in place to protect them. So, coming out of the experience of Qatar 2022 with some disappointment and looking forward to the Saudi 2034, the main sentiment is just trepidation, bordering on horror at what could be about to unfold.
That sounds so worrisome, Nick. And perhaps one of the things that came to my mind was that it sounds like quite a big contradiction, because on the one hand, you have all of this massive infrastructure, which sounds like things which require a hell of a lot of capital. And on the other hand, you have these workers who, are essentially being put in, as you said, almost like slavery-like conditions, especially in certain circumstances where we look at it and we say, oh, this is forced labor, these are other forms of modern slavery. So I suppose I wanted to ask you, is there some lack of care from the side of the authorities? What's going on there? Because it seems like they're quite capital flush, right?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So back in the 60s, the foreign labour that existed in the Gulf tended to come from Arab states. So it would come from, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, places like that. And the Gulf states at the time were quite worried about that to some extent, because what was happening was that these workers were coming from places that were quite politicized. And this is in an era of increasing sort of pan-Arab nationalism. And the Gulf states were terribly concerned about the idea that they might bring into the country political actors who would then sort of engage in the type of political activism, trade unionism, for example, that might put them in jeopardy, that might bring in a demographic that would pose a political threat to them. It was around this time that they shifted entirely and they pivoted to South Asia, where they could essentially bring in all of the workers that they need. to fulfill these economic projects and plans that they had. That's when vast amounts of workers started coming in from India, from the Philippines, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh. And what happened there was that these workers were culturally distinct, religiously often distinct, linguistically distinct. And so they became essentially an underclass to an extent that workers from Arab nations were never likely to be. What that has fostered in the Gulf is this system of structured and stratified racism, I would say, where you have Gulf nationals at the top, often accompanied by Western wealthy expatriates and other wealthy Arab expatriates. And then going down the scale, you have different levels of workers from impoverished South Asian countries and increasingly East African countries. And all of them are subject, unfortunately, to this appalling racism that exists. And to be honest, I think that's why people generally don't care, because they've been able to bring these workers in cheaply. They're able to pay them very little, which results in them being housed in sort of shanty towns, essentially, on the outskirts of these big fancy gleaming cities like Dubai and Doha and Riyadh that we see. The workers don't live in anywhere like that. They live in dusty, unsanitary labour camps. And so what you end up with is this sort of stratified society. On the one hand, wealthy Gulf nationals, wealthy expatriates with the 5-star hotels and the fancy cars and so on and so forth. And the flip side of that is this underclass of unpaid workers living in unsanitary conditions and not, being paid well at all. So it's created this two-tier society, and the racism that fosters, I think, is ultimately what leads to people not caring about what happens to workers. I mean, I lived in Abu Dhabi for 4 years, and the thing that struck me, and the thing that I was horrified by, how many of the Western expatriates displayed open contempt and openly racist attitudes towards the migrant workers, the type of stuff that they would never consider saying back home in the UK. It was open season on that stuff there. So it's a long, rambling answer to say the answer is racism, unfortunately.
No, thanks for your candor, Nick. And that's the thing, right? I think that it's necessary to call it as it is. And aside from human rights sort of groups and unions and all of that in different parts of the world, including from the region, I don't necessarily always see it called out like that. So I'm glad you said so. And I think that harkening back to that history of what was happening in the 1960s and thereafter, I suppose this is also coinciding with Nasser's time and Pan-Arabism and things like that. Because again, to my knowledge as well, it sounds like the Gulf states have typically also been quite an outlier to that. And thereafter, that has also caused tensions between them and citizens of other Arab states who perhaps envision alternative futures for themselves where they sort of forge their own futures, right? Like rather than essentially be under monarchs. So
exactly.
So that's very interesting. So thank you for that. And I recall that you had done a bunch at FairSquare of reports, which were really fascinating on heat. So could you talk a little bit about heat and heat impacts on workers? I mean, how does this also link with sport and people maybe working outside in the heat?
Sure, yeah. Well, it's sort of the issue that fascinated us was workers' deaths, the stats that were coming out on worker deaths. There was a lot of talk about this in the run-up to the Qatar World Cup. And what we looked at it and were sort of surprised by was that everyone was talking about numbers. 1,500 workers have died, 4,000 workers will die, etc. You were getting sort of statements like that and estimates like that, but nobody was saying, well, how are these workers dying? And to what extent is negligence a factor? Now, having lived in the Gulf and having researched what happens to migrant workers, I mean, it's no surprise that workers are dying. They live in appalling conditions. They must be incredibly stressed. The heat is it's jaw-dropping if you've ever sort of experienced it.
It was very hot in Qatar. It got up to 52 degrees Celsius the first year I was there. I used to sweat in the exact way as if it was raining from the sky.
You know how hot 52 degrees Celsius is? It's 125 degrees Fahrenheit. If you build a stadium in that heat, you should get to own it.
And so the idea that these workers would die and get sick just didn't seem a surprise. And yet there was no real data on it. There was nobody sort of going into this and actually digging into what are the causes of death and what protection is in place. Heat's really interesting because, to be honest, it's the risk where you can most easily and accurately identify the gap between the protection that should be on offer to anyone who's outside working in the heat and the protection that is on offer. The protection that the Gulf states offer basically is they put a ban on work in the middle of the day in the hottest months of the year. That's basically it. It's this kind of semi-arbitrary blanket ban on all work at certain times where they consider the risk to be highest. It's an absurd way of approaching risk from heat because the risk from heat in the Gulf can be exceptionally high outside of these times and outside of these hours of the day. I mean, if you take July, for example, in somewhere like Abu Dhabi, what you might find is that in July, the daytime temperature would be, anywhere up to 45, 46 degrees. At nighttime, that will go down. Yeah, it will go down to maybe 31, which is still pretty hot. But what you find in the nighttime is that humidity will shoot up from something like 20, 30% up to 80%. And the risk from heat to workers is a combination of the air temperature and the humidity. It's a combination of those things and a couple of other factors. And what happens when you do a proper risk assessment by drawing on climate data that you can very easily draw on from multiple pretty accurate sources. And when you map out the risk, it is just quite remarkably high for extended periods of time throughout the year. The protection, the ban on work, is in place for a very small amount of time. Upshot is you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of workers who are outside at times when the climate poses a serious and material risk to their health, if not their lives. Now, unfortunately, despite a lot of work that was done on the Qatar World Cup in relation to this issue, they put in place a pretty shoddy heat protection ban, and Saudi Arabia doesn't have a better one. So it's not the only risk. I mean, I think it's important to say that there are other multiple risks associated with poor health and safety, poor living conditions, inability to access healthcare. That's a huge problem in the Gulf. You find lots of workers, their only healthcare is, for example, taking Panadol, which is good for a headache, but it's not something you want to be taking on a consistent basis for all sorts of ailments. So all of these things are interlinked, but heat is the one, as I said at the start of the answer, where you can easily identify a very obvious lack of protection. Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. That's so illuminating. And it also reminds me of this conversation we had when we interviewed a researcher who works a lot on heat, national plans relating to heat here in India. And essentially what he was saying is even things like your basic tree cover can reduce, like there's a politics around shade.
Shade is a privilege. It is an elite commodity. And one of the things we did in the study recently was try and figure out a little bit about where the state plants its trees. And we had some very candid answers from some of these bureaucrats who are in charge of urban afforestation programs. And they said, look, we have, 300,000 trees that we want to plant, and we're meeting our targets. But the problem is the trees are being planted in areas where there are no people, because that's where the land is. If you wanted to actually plant a tree where the heat is and where the people are, you run into pretty stiff roadblocks right at the outset because that land is hugely contested, it's hugely valuable. You can imagine the prospect of planting a tree is going to be a political thing.
One would think that everyone has equitable access to something like standing beneath a tree, but that is seldom the case because our cities are so designed in such an inequitable way. And obviously, like what you were describing of different cities in the Gulf, you were talking about Abu Dhabi. I'm sure that is extremely stark there, and it must be quite bad even within workers' quarters, right, in terms of ventilation and things.
Exactly. What's fascinating at heat, the science behind it, it's not that complex, right? And as you say, Abu Dhabi doesn't, really, the construction sites that they operate in the Gulf, you would have great concerns about the extent to which they have that type of shade. It's compounded, as you addressed, by the lack of air conditioning. So the time when the body is supposed to recover from a hard day's work is at night when you sleep. Yeah. And the only way you can do that is if your quarters are cooled and ventilated. So what you often find is that, unfortunately, the workers don't have air conditioning or the air conditioning is malfunctioning. And one of the great concerns when you speak to people who are experts in heat stress, which is fatal in many cases, and you ask them, why are so many workers dying in their sleep? And the response is, well, it could be to do with the fact that this is the period of time when their bodies are supposed to be recovering and actually aren't. There's a phenomenon which migrant workers in the Gulf talk about, which is sleeping death, because so many of their colleagues go to bed and then just don't wake up and they die in the night. Now, there's no science to establish definitively that that is what's killing them. But I've spoken to multiple experts on heat stress throughout years of working on this. And certainly the hunch that many of them have is, well, that is probably related to the body's inability to cool down after this incredibly intense and arduous day of work in the heat, and then being put into a place where the body should cool at night, the sleeping quarters, which are not themselves cooled.
That is deeply tragic, right, Nick? I hadn't heard of this sort of sleeping death before. And it sounds so sad because essentially someone who must have been toiling all day is essentially finally laying down to sleep, or at least so they think, and then they pass away. That's awful.
Awful,
yeah. And I'm sure that their families, most of these must be young single men, right? Because their families are back home.
Typically young single men. And then the further tragedy, to pile tragedy upon tragedy, is that that work will be just written down as natural death. There will be no investigation done into it. There'll be no examination of the extent to which it might have been related to work in unsafe conditions in the days or weeks leading up to the death. There'll be no examination of the extent to which living quarters were properly cooled and ventilated. That won't happen. There'll be no medical history for the patient because he probably hasn't been to a hospital or a clinic his entire time there. A 25-year-old son, husband, father, they could have put themselves into an incredible amount of debt to get that person the job in the Gulf. And then suddenly one day he turns up in a coffin and that's all that's written on the coffin. They have no information on it and there's no recourse to the type of compensation that a death through an accident, might yield the family. So and this happens again and again, time and again, in all the Gulf states to all sorts of nationals, Indians, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Kenyans. It's really quite a horrendous situation, given how relatively easy it would be to put in place basic protection and basic investigation to ensure that workers don't die. And if they do die, we find out how they die and we ensure that the families get the compensation that they deserve and that the people who are responsible are properly sanctioned to put in place some sort of deterrent effect to stop it happening to another young man and his family.
That is so deeply upsetting. And I think it sounds like a situation where all of these destination countries, Saudi included, and we're talking about Saudi because of the 2034 World Cup that's going to come up. I think it sounds like a circumstance where there are people who are in dire need of jobs, often from these different, for instance, South Asian countries. And then they are put in these circumstances because they're sort of preying on their vulnerabilities, right?
Right.
Listeners, do stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.
तो आप लोग कहाँ से आए हैं? बनारस से।
ना वेलोर साइड इल्ले इवर वसूर। सुबह 6 बजे उठना है, 6 बजे 7 बजे काम करा जाता है। कभी रात को 9 बजे तक काम करते हैं। 8-10 घंटे हो जाएगा। 10 घंटे से ऊपर होता है। ஒரு நாளைக்கு ரெண்டுத்துல ஒரு படம் 1.5 படம் ஓட்டுங்க. கரண்ட் இருந்தால் 1.5 ஓடும், கரண்ட் இல்லைன்னா ஒரு படம் வரும். ஒரு படகுக்கு வந்து 240 ரூபா 250 ரூபா. ஒரு நாளைக்கு மொத்தமாக வந்து ஒரு 500 ரூபா 600 ரூபா. கரண்ட் இருந்தால் ஒரு 600 ரூபா சம்பாதிக்கலாம், இல்லைன்னா மினிமம் ஒரு 500 ரூபா அவ்வளோதான்.
Watch the video story Inside Bengaluru's Power Looms, Migrant Lives Running on Shifts and Dust, only on the migrationstory.com.
For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. An excerpt from an essay by Audre Lorde. I mean, moving from given that the circumstances are so dire, and there is some time, I mean, obviously the situation sounds very dire, but there is some time now in the lead up to the World Cup. What would you suggest, like, to different actors? So, for instance, what are the sort of reforms one would expect of the government of Saudi to make sure that what we saw in Qatar doesn't happen in Saudi also? You know, this kind of thing. And countries from whom or from where immigrants tend to go. So whether it's India, Bangladesh, Nepal, so on. What are your recommendations in general?
Yeah, I mean, the situation is dire. And yet the hope derives from the fact that it can be fixed. That these are incredibly wealthy nations who would have to invest a tiny, tiny fraction of their wealth to ensure that these workers are properly protected. And also from the fact, I think, that, you know, the South Asian origin countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, are in a position of leverage over the Gulf states because they supply them with about 80% of their workforce. Sorry, it's more than that, in fact. It's probably, well, it's about 80%. It's huge. Essentially, these countries would cease to function if South Asian countries stopped providing them with labour or if South Asian labourers stopped doing the work. So what needs to happen is they need to essentially dismantle what's known as the kafala system. The kafala system is a system of sponsorship-based employment that ensures that employers, rather than the state, are responsible for the welfare and the right of their workers. It's been in place since the British actually put it in place in Bahrain, I think in the 1920s. As ever, the British are the root cause of many of the world's ills. So that needs to be dismantled. It's tricky. It's a technical task. It wouldn't just require law changes. It requires a shift in thinking about how migrant workers are treated. It would require a lot of work done on educating people on the dangers of racism. It would require a lot of work done on humanising migrant workers, and part of that would involve paying them more and putting them into better housing. So it's not a simple task by any matter of means, but it is entirely doable. The other thing that would have to happen in the short term is you need better protection from heat. You need to make sure that workers have access to hospitals and can get the care that they need in a timely fashion. Again, all of these things are doable. The Gulf states have some of the best healthcare systems in the world, if not the best. It's just that migrant workers can't access them. The question is, how do we get all that? And that's more difficult. The Gulf states, there is no political pressure on them, no serious political pressure on them to put these reforms in place. In fact, the type of labour model, the kafala-based model that they have had in place for so long is actually being imported into the West, I would say. Increasingly, the UK, for example, where I'm from, you see lots of workers on sponsorship-based type agreements, low-paid workers, incredibly vulnerable to worker exploitation and with, ineffective recourse to the state mechanisms. So it is not as if we have been in any way successful in breaking down the kafala system. If anything, it's more powerful and more entrenched. So it's a difficult situation. One of the things that I think I've been sort of saying for a long time is don't expect Western NGOs or the Western media to be able to apply enough pressure on this issue via the World Cup to make any meaningful difference. By and large, people in Western states don't care about Indian workers being abused in the Gulf. I think, the hope I have is that the leverage that South Asian states have, the influence that they have can be effectively leveraged, but that would require the type of public outrage in places like India and Bangladesh and Pakistan that we have yet really to see.
So one of the actors I didn't ask about previously was FIFA in a little more detail. So when you were describing their role, for instance, the FIFA Congress in the context of Qatar, you sounded a little bit, honestly, miffed, like they could have done a lot more. So perhaps, and it sounds very rightly so. So what should FIFA be doing in the days to come, ideally, rather than the current role? What's your take?
Right. You picked up on me being miffed. Definitely. It definitely was. What FIFA should do. What FIFA should do is it should offer the World Cup to countries who are willing and able to build, to prepare themselves in a manner that is consistent with basic human values of dignity, or if you want to be technical about it, international labour standards and human rights law. They could, for example, go into Saudi Arabia and say, yes, you can have this World Cup. Yeah. But in order to get that, we need you, and we need to see that you have reformed your labour system, that you're going to protect all of the workers who are coming into that labour system. So we're going to use our leverage. Yeah, you can have this tournament, but only under certain conditions. Yeah, and these conditions are X, Y, and Z. Now, they do not do that, and they have never done that. And the reason they don't do it, well, you have to look at FIFA's business model, essentially, for that. FIFA only makes money 1 year out of 4. And it makes money every time they host a men's World Cup, predominantly. I mean, there's a women's World Cup too, but it's nowhere near as lucrative. The men's World Cup is the real money spinner for them. It's how they make all their money. And so they make their money from sponsoring the tournament, or people sponsoring the tournament, and people paying for the TV rights for the tournament. That's how FIFA makes its money. They pass on all the costs of building the tournament to the host. So FIFA's not paying for these stadiums or these roads or all the stuff or the hotels. Saudi Arabia is paying for all those things. And FIFA doesn't care how much they pay, doesn't care how many very lucrative construction contracts get paid to the Al Saud family or their allies in Saudi Arabia. They turn a completely blind eye. All they care about is that they make as much money as possible from the tournament. The other thing they want is they want tax breaks from the hosts. So all of the money that's made in, for example, US 2026, which is hosting next year's World Cup, that will all be tax exempt for FIFA. The same will go for Morocco in 2030. Spain and Portugal are co-hosts there. They'll be getting tax exemptions on that. So they invest, the reason this is relevant, they invest all of their political capital and influence with hosts in making sure that the tournament looks as good as possible for the sponsors and the broadcasters, and making sure that they get as much tax-free revenue as possible. So they are never going to go to the host and say, sorry, could you make sure that these workers are protected? Or sorry, could you make sure, that there's no police violence around the stadium, or that you don't clear out street traders around the stadium? They're not interested in doing that, and they never will. So you have a situation where this big organization goes around the world, essentially enabling the worst instincts of whatever host government is in place, directly contributing and exacerbating the human rights abuses that could coexist with the type of tournament, and exerting no positive pressure whatsoever. And in fact, I think the only way that we could see a positive impact from 2034, realistically in this timeframe, is if we are successful in putting some pressure on FIFA to essentially overhaul how it is run and how it is governed.
So I had another question for you in terms of human rights due diligence. So obviously one of the things that has come up a lot in recent times is this idea of having some kind of due diligence system which is premised on human rights.
Yeah.
So would you say that supposing first of all, it would be useful to hear a little bit about what that system looks like. And the second is, do you think, so for instance, if you're constructing a stadium, there should be some type of human rights due diligence standards applied to that in wherever it is in the world, as you were saying, global north, global south?
Yeah, I think it does make sense, because the thing about sporting tournaments is that they have to be, and this is what's different about other construction products, right? When you build a bridge, you say it's going to be ready in 2024, If it's ready in 2025, it's not great, but it's not a problem, right? But when you say you're going to deliver a tournament in 2024, and it's going to start on June the 1st, 2024, it has to be delivered then, So the time frame for a mega sporting event is completely different from the time frame for any other type of construction project. You're not allowed to overrun, because then the whole thing falls apart. So there is a tremendous amount of pressure on the organisers and on the people building it, and a tremendous incentive, therefore, to cut corners, whether it's labour rights or any other factor that could be in play. So human rights due diligence in the context of mega sporting events does make sense. It's like, okay, how are we going to make sure that this tournament, which has particular risks associated with it, has mitigation steps in place? And it is up to, the governing body, whether it's FIFA or the International Olympic Committee, to demand human rights due diligence plans from the organisers. Okay, so you're going to build this stadium. Okay, how are you going to do it? How are you going to protect the people who build it? And how are you going to protect the people who work in it for a few weeks while this tournament is on? That's essentially what the human rights due diligence is. So I think there is value in it. I think it makes sense to have them. The problem, I think, there's a couple of problems. One, it only works if you're serious about it. Yeah. And I don't think FIFA is serious about it. I don't think the International Olympic Committee are particularly serious about it. I think it is something that's been foisted on them. And I think it is something of a tick box exercise for them. Obviously, there are people within these organizations who are serious about it. But if at any point the human rights due diligence process impacts on the commercial aspects of the tournament, we know who's going to win out in that fight. And it's not going to be the human rights. It's going to be the commerce guys. You know, these things have to deliver the revenue to fulfill the business model upon which they're based. So I don't think the sports governing bodies are serious about them. In the golf context, I think they're hugely problematic. I don't think you can go into the golf where it is the Wild West, where the labour system is concerned. It's anything goes. There essentially is no regulation. You can get away with more or less whatever you want in the golf context. And so the idea that you can go in there and put specific protection around a specific tournament ignores the reality of the wider depredations of the labour sector. So again, I think there is value to human rights due diligence practices where businesses are concerned. I think they have oftentimes limited utility and value. But when it comes to mega sporting events, I think there is a bigger need for them, but also a lack of institutional buy-in to what would be required to make them effective. And in the golf context, I just don't think they'll ever be effective.
Thanks, Nick. And it sounds very myopic, right? Because it's on two levels. One is the question of basic human decency, where you don't ever want to have someone abused in this manner, regardless of where they come from in the world or, what is their nationality, race, gender, and so on. And then the second side of this being myopic is that it clearly has happy, healthy workers always make for better outputs too. And I think that so many institutions have learned this the hard way. And the fact that they can't see the financial repercussions of that too, though we shouldn't have to look at it through that lens, but it shows how short-termist they are in their view as well. I think that I know I've kept you for a long time, so perhaps we can wind up with two questions. The first is a more serious one about this recent rumor that ran through the rumor mill, which was about Saudi abolishing kafala. I had spoken to Vani about it briefly, but what's your take? Is it ever possible for that to happen? That's one. And then the second, on a lighter note, if you have any book suggestions or something like that, which you enjoyed and made you think about all the amazing work you've done on sport and human rights. So over to you.
Well, I don't think Saudi has abolished the kafala system. It looks like a PR trick. I mean, I was most amused to see myself quoted in an article in which I supposedly commented on Saudi Arabia having abolished the kafala system by an outlet to whom I had never spoken. So I think Saudi Arabia is doing what Qatar did, which is trying to get out the narrative that it's abolishing kafala, but actually not doing the hard yards of picking it to pieces. Of course they can. I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't abolish it. And there's no reason why they couldn't put in place a basic system that protected the rights of everybody in the country. And, obviously there would be, workers are always going to be abused in low-paid jobs. It's just a reality. But there is no need to have such an abusive system in place to keep these workers under such appalling levels of control. So hopefully at some point we will see the end of that. Book suggestions. Oh God, you remember my blood run cold there? Because I'm thinking, what have I read recently?
What about movies? Movies or I don't know, something with pop culture.
There's a really good movie on, and it sort of combines football and workers' rights, called The Workers' Cup.
This is not life, man. It's like you're trapped or something.
Which is a tremendous piece of work about a tournament that was set up for the workers building the Qatar 2022 World Cup. And it follows the various teams as they try to progress through this tournament. And it's a really glorious film because it sort of celebrates the humanity of these young men and their just utter joy at being involved in a football tournament that gets them away from the drudgery of their everyday lives. I actually used it as an advocacy tool in the run-up to Qatar 2022. Rather than sort of showing a report to somebody, I would be, watch this film. This film will give you a better grip of what's going on there and why it's so unjustifiable and unforgivable than anything. So I would highly recommend that to anyone who's interested in it. And I'm going to put a plug out for a video we did on Heat, which is called Matchstick Men, which you can find on YouTube. You can put in Matchstick Men, FairSquare. You can see this little animation.
uncle used to say that there are 3 types of people: dead, alive, and those in the desert. He called his Gulf experience a trial by fire. Many lives are extinguished. Some, like
It was done by a glorious Indian graphic novelist called Apupen.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
a fan of Apupan as well. So we'll definitely hyperlink these, Nick, so
Please do.
listeners can follow up with those links as well. And I think that's a wonderful note to end on, though, Nick. This has been such a fascinating conversation, very sort of humbling in terms of thinking the road that lies ahead. But it also sounds like there are so many concrete things that can be done. And I hope that all of the stakeholders that you alluded to actually think of the things that can be done, because there is time in the lead up to the 2034 World Cup in Saudi Arabia. But thank you so much. Keep up the amazing work, and we will keep following you for more.
Thanks, Namrata. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. The audio editing and sound design is by Akshay Ramuhalli. Stay tuned for more stories on migration.
The Migration Story.